Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, tonight I want to talk about our responsibility here in the United States Senate to reopen the government, to get back to work, solving real problems, and to fix the system around here so that we aren't tempted to play political games with government shutdowns in the future. We're now in the second day of what I think is kind of a senseless shutdown. It's not helping anybody. A lot of disruption, dislocation, dysfunction for no reason. The situation was perhaps best described by Democratic leader Chuck Schumer in 2013 when he said, and I quote, "Look, I believe in immigration reform. What if I persuaded my caucus to say I'm going to shut the government down and I'm not going to pay our bills unless I get my way? It's a politics of idiocy, of confrontation, of paralysis." End quote. I think Chuck Schumer was right. And by the way, I think the lesson of 2013 in that shutdown is that they don't work. I think they're a bad idea. They're unnecessary disruptions. They hurt our economy. They hurt families. They hurt our troops. And by the way, ultimately, they also cost the taxpayers more money, not less. That's been the history. That's why for 6 years now, I've been fighting to pass legislation called End Government Shutdowns. It's a very simple piece of legislation. And by the way, my efforts in that have spanned presidents of both parties and of majorities here in the Senate of both parties. It's not a political issue. We should end government shutdowns. More on that in a minute. But let's take a look at the real-world impact of a shutdown. In my home state of Ohio, nearly 50,000 federal workers are seeing their paychecks halted through no fault of their own. This includes rangers at parks across the state, like Cuyahoga Valley National Park. This includes employees at NASA Glenn, 3,000 of them. It includes thousands of civilian employees at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And thousands of other federal employees around the Buckeye State are going to be hurt. Hurt why? Because of partisan politics here in Washington, D.C. By the way, federal contractors, I'm told, are being told they can't go to work, and yet they're going to get paid after the fact. How does that help taxpayers? How do we get here? Well, spending goes through Congress. The Constitution says Congress alone has the power of the purse, so every dime that's appropriated of spending has to go through this place. Unfortunately, since the fiscal year ended on September 30th, Democrats and Republicans in Congress have been unable to agree on an overall budget plan that allows us to fund what are 12 annual spending bills. Since then, we have passed 3 of these so-called continuing resolutions. They're also called CRs. They provide short-term funding for the government, basically a continuation of the spending of last year, just to keep the government from shutting down. That's what CRs do. But they don't include any new policies, typically. They don't include the new spending levels for the new fiscal year. But it's just to keep things going and keep government operating. Nobody likes them. I don't like continuing resolutions. Who would? But the alternative is either come to an agreement on these 12 annual spending bills we talked about, or have the government shut down. That was considered unthinkable over the last 4 months when these continuing resolutions were passed by big bipartisan majorities of both the House and the Senate. By the way, 8 of these 12 annual spending bills that I was talking about, they actually passed out of committee with big bipartisan votes. So 8 of the 12 actually have been passed. They're ready to come to the Senate floor, but they haven't come to the Senate floor because they require 60 votes out of 100 to be brought up. And Democrats, not having a solution to what the overall spending levels will be, have not cooperated to bring those individual spending bills to the floor. That's obviously the best way to do this, is to have these 12 spending bills come to the floor, have the debate, put the best policies in place, have the right level of spending for this fiscal year. That hasn't happened. So you have these short-term continuing resolutions. Now you might ask, well, how can the continuing resolutions pass? Because they don't seem to, be very popular. Well, but they're better than a shutdown. And by the way, they also require 60 votes. But again, it's the one thing we've been able to pass over the past 4 months to avoid shutdowns while we negotiated our differences over the level of spending, over the policies that are going to be in place between now and the rest of the fiscal year. And they've always passed, again, on a broad bipartisan basis. Some Democrats have voted with us to keep our government open in the past because, as the Democratic leader has said, shutting down the government just doesn't make any sense. In order to pass a CR, a continuing resolution, only 39 senators can vote no, because again, you have to get 40. On Friday night, 44 Democrats chose to vote down the latest CR. Even though almost nothing of substance has changed in the continuing resolution since the last continuing resolution that was voted on, again, by big majorities. The only thing that's changed is that there was added a very popular and urgent extension of a health care program called the CHIP program, Children's Health Insurance Program. Absolutely critical that we pass that because in the next couple of weeks, we're told, some states will begin to run out of money. CHIP expired actually back in September, and it's had short-term fixes since then. In this continuing resolution, same as the last continuing resolutions, basically, nobody really objects to what's in the continuing resolution, but the addition has been this really important program, CHIP, is reauthorized. And by the way, it's reauthorized for its longest authorization ever in the history of the program, a 6-year reauthorization, which I strongly support, and I think my colleagues do, across the board. If we don't deal with CHIP, again, this is urgent enough that some states are actually going to run out of money. So some are choosing to shut down the government, even though they can't point to anything in the short-term continuing resolution that they disagree with, and even though it endangers the health care of children and families around the country. That's where we are. The main reason we've heard from Democrats who oppose an otherwise acceptable continuing resolution is what we just heard here tonight from some of my colleagues on the other side, including colleagues I work with a lot on other issues, and I respect them. But they have said that this is about something else, not the spending bill, but it's about how we deal with DACA and broader immigration reform. I want to resolve DACA too, and I believe most of the members of this body sincerely want to resolve DACA. It was an administrative program that was appropriate to be legislated. The President gave us until March to deal with it. We must and should deal with it. And there's an ongoing good faith effort to resolve the DACA issue as well as broader immigration issues, like border security. And to do all that before DACA expires on March 5th, which is 6 weeks away. There's been a lot of finger pointing, and there's always plenty of room for that around here, let's face it. But the situation is clear. We are in day 2 of a shutdown because my Democratic colleagues are holding hostage the entire federal government and children in need of health care through CHIP for a non-spending issue that is being worked on, and we all know expires on March 5th, and we need to deal with. Without a spending bill or a continuing resolution to keep the government open short-term while we come to an agreement on larger issues, there are a bunch of federal workers who are going to wake up tomorrow morning and find themselves furloughed. Many won't be able to go to work because their offices are closed. Some will, I'm told, have to report to work, but they're not going to get paid, at least until the government reopens. And again, the taxpayer always ends up getting the short end of the stick on this. I just think it's crazy that we're allowing this to happen. It doesn't make any sense. I don't get it. Yes, there are some larger issues we've got to come together on and solve in a bipartisan way. But we should agree to a short-term funding deal to just get the government up and running, then move on to solving those problems. Because we're not working on them now, I can tell you, because everybody is distracted by this issue of government shutdown. My understanding is that we're going to vote on a new proposal tonight to reopen the government. It's shorter term. Why? Because a number of Democrats have said that they think that the previous continuing resolution, which was for 4 weeks, was too long. So this one will be just 2.5 weeks. Till February 8th. That's fine with me. I think that gives us enough time to resolve these issues and yet enough time to actually put the changes into legislation, 2.5 weeks. That'd be pretty fast by congressional time. I understand the new CR proposal will also be coupled with these important CHIP funding proposals, in other words, the long-term extension of the Children's Health Insurance Program, which is important, and a commitment to continue the negotiations to address all the outstanding issues, including DACA. including defense spending, including disaster relief. Let's support it. Let's get this behind us. Let's be sure people don't wake up on Monday morning to find that they're furloughed. And then let's get back to these hard issues that we were hired to resolve. I know it's a lot harder dealing with those substantive issues than dealing with these political issues. It's easy to shut down government. That doesn't take any ingenuity or imagination. That's easy. It's harder to deal with these tough issues, but that's what we've got to do. Shutdowns aren't the answer. The situation tonight is a reminder that we should end government shutdowns for good. And again, that's why I've introduced bipartisan legislation I mentioned earlier called the End Government Shutdowns Act to avoid these types of unnecessary disruptions that are unproductive and unfair to our constituents. The bill would simply continue spending from the previous year for 120 days if any appropriations bill or any CR is not agreed to by the established deadline. And then it would gradually decline that funding by 1%, and then 1%, to give lawmakers the incentive that's needed around here to actually come together on a funding agreement. I think it's sensible. I think it's common sense. It's always been bipartisan in the past. Hope we can get it done. By the way, I first introduced this bill in 2012 with my Democratic colleague, John Tester from Montana, when a Democratic president, President Obama, was in the White House, and Democrats controlled the Senate. So this is a common sense solution that benefits the country, not one political party or another. It's what's best for our country. If this bill were law, we wouldn't be in this situation. Instead, we'd be talking about the substantive issues, how we resolve DACA, how we resolve disaster spending, how we resolve defense spending. We've had 18 shutdowns in our country's history, and none of them would have happened if this was law. There would be no last-minute political brinkmanship over issues unrelated to funding our government. Our constituents, including federal employees, would not have their lives disrupted. Taxpayers wouldn't get fleeced by shutdowns and the back pay that happens and the inefficiencies. Our legislation is bipartisan, but frankly, we need a lot more members to support it and help us put in place a long-term solution to make sure these shutdowns don't continue to happen. So I urge my colleagues tonight, and any staff that might be watching, please sign up on this legislation. We need your help. It's common sense. It's a time at which I hope we all realize these shutdowns don't make sense, and we have an alternative. The shutdown isn't helping anyone. It isn't helping Americans who need access to vital government services. It isn't helping federal employees who should instead be working, not be furloughed. And it sure isn't helping the 9 million children who are in need of basic health care services under CHIP. There are bipartisan discussions going on right now. I've talked to colleagues on both sides of the aisle this afternoon and this evening. I think those discussions have been productive. Let's hope they're successful. Let's hope we can resolve this thing tonight. Let's hope we can have a vote to give the American people the certainty and predictability they're looking for. Let's reopen government, and let's get back to work. I hope all my colleagues will join me in doing that tonight. I yield back my time.